All right, for more, let's bring in our strategist panel. Joining us now is Susan Smith, a Liberal strategist, also a co-founder and principal at Blue Sky Strategy Group. Also here you see Cole Hogan, a Conservative strategist. Welcome once again to you both.
Thanks for having us.
So I want to start with this pipeline story on Parliament Hill, the idea that an agreement between Alberta and the federal government could include this potential carve-out of the BC tanker ban. We've heard from BC Liberals talking about this. They're really focusing on the fact that the BC government and First Nations need to have their say on this, that there needs to be consent. We've heard a former cabinet minister, Karina Gold, saying, look, there was big public demand for this tanker ban when it came in. So, Susan, as the story moves forward, is there a risk for the Prime Minister within his own caucus if this does indeed come to pass when it comes to that ban?
It's not an uncomplicated question. The BC economy is in the toilet at the moment, but what the Prime Minister has said for any major projects that go forward, there has to be the consultation process with all relevant parties, and the relevant parties in this include the BC government and includes coastal First Nations. So before anything can happen, well, there isn't a project yet, there isn't a proponent yet, but when and if those things get identified, then a proper consultation process will have to happen. I don't think anybody can reasonably expect unanimity on anything. We're not unanimous around our kitchen tables typically when we have a conversation about things. But I think there'll have to be proper consultation. And I think you're already hearing Scott Moe weigh in, Danielle Smith, Premier Eby. So I think there will be a very high, intense level of discussion that takes place, and maybe a ground level discussion takes place. So I think it'll be a while before you see resolution and a path.
Okay, so yeah, it's a long-lasting story. It could go on for a while. But Cole, weigh in on this, on the pressure the Prime Minister might face within his own party, not just from BC MPs, but also progressive MPs who might not like this idea of any kind of change to that tanker ban.
Sure. I think there's a few things at play here that are very interesting to watch. One, I think it's a good thing that the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, and the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, have a solid, productive working relationship right now. We've seen Danielle Smith say that, in her opinion, Justin Trudeau really accelerated the feelings of Western alienation and Western independence in Alberta, but that Mark Carney could address this by bringing in some new national energy projects from Alberta to the coast to bring in some new pipeline projects. But as we've mentioned, what will be the opposition in Mark Carney's Liberal caucus? The prime suspect for such a thing would be someone like Stephen Guilbeault, who has said we have enough pipeline infrastructure, we don't need any more. But the fact of the matter is, oil and gas does pay the bills in this country. It pays for healthcare, it pays for social programs, and when we're in this substantial of financial dire straits, I think that's the kind of project we need to get going, and we'll see if the Liberals oppose that.
Okay, Susan, you talked about the various parties at play here, the BC government, the First Nations, other premiers. Certainly, look, Alberta is not necessarily a key to Liberal fortunes electorally, but Danielle Smith has said, look, this is a matter of national unity when it comes to pipelines. So do you see a scenario where the Prime Minister might eventually have to pick a side if BC and Alberta stay at loggerheads on this?
I think the Prime Minister is wise enough to let the process take its course, and I think Canadians don't want to be held hostage by any one premier, and the unity of the country should never be held hostage by one premier. We've fought back as a country against that when there were premiers in Quebec. At that point in time, Canadians and Albertans, quite frankly, will fight back against that if Premier Smith tries to paint this in this light, and I think she probably will. But Canadians are reasonable people. They expect reasonable discussion to take place. They're not big on hammers being dropped, whether it's from a premier or a prime minister. And so I think the process will have to play out. What the Prime Minister set up with Bill C-5 and the major projects exercise is to be able to get to a yes or a no a lot more quickly. Just because you make the list doesn't mean you get passed, because the consultations and the discussions and the environmental processes have to take place. So that's what I look forward to seeing. If we can get it done, let's get it done. But if it doesn't work through the process that's been put out, then they have to find something else to do.
And Cole, if it can get done, what would it mean for resetting the relationship between Alberta and the federal government, between a Conservative Premier and a Liberal Prime Minister, especially with all the talk that we've been hearing over the past several months about Alberta sovereignty?
Well, yeah, I think I agree with Danielle Smith that I think it would address some concerns and some Alberta independence sentiment in the West, but we're seeing some shifting political terrain just generally where the Premier of Alberta has a better relationship with a Liberal Prime Minister than the NDP Premier of British Columbia. And what's interesting here is, I have to reference, I did have the privilege of going to school at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, where I took multiple constitutional law classes. And so that allows me to say one thing that BC NDP Premier David Eby won't say, and that is when there is an energy project that crosses multiple provincial boundaries, that's the federal government's jurisdiction as per the Constitution. So David Eby has no real constitutional or legal grounds to oppose any pipeline project going through his province, and I think he's holding the country back because of it.
I think it's a false premise, though, to put the entire relationship of Canada and Alberta on a project that involves the provinces, the First Nations, environmental assessments. I don't actually think that's fair or reasonable. Canadians don't see the world in black and white. They want due process. They want transparency on process. And to hinge the country and the future of the country on whether Danielle Smith's going to get her way or not, and whether she's going to stomp her feet and tip the Monopoly game over. I think that's not a responsible way to view the country. And I think we have to be careful when we're talking about this project to say that there are multiple players in this for good reason.
Yeah, if I could just jump on Susan's point for a second, I think for Alberta in particular, they saw the last 10 years of the Justin Trudeau government as pretty antagonistic towards Alberta and not friendly towards the natural resource and energy sector. So seeing Mark Carney's government, and they've been trying to differentiate themselves from the Trudeau record with a lot of their announcements and in style and tone. So moving forward on an energy project, particularly an oil and gas pipeline, would send a message to any aggrieved Albertan that, look, this isn't the Justin Trudeau Liberals, and I'd commend them for doing so.
Okay, I want to turn to the situation in the House of Commons. We, of course, had that confidence vote earlier this week, a very close vote. It took opposition MPs abstaining to keep the government from being defeated on the budget. We did hear the government House Leader, Stephen McKinnon, this week say that, yes, this Parliament is still sustainable in its current form. We're going to keep working away. Susan, do you think the government is in a sustainable situation right now?
I don't think anybody wants the election, and proof was in the pudding this week. Pierre Poilievre doesn't want an election. He just won a seat because he lost the whole election and he lost his whole seat. He doesn't want to go back to the polls. He's got a leadership right now. And if he went to the polls, I think his math is that the Conservatives would not fare better in this snapshot and moment in time. The same applies to the NDP. They're leaderless, bank accountless, and a leadership isn't coming forward till March. And they don't likely look like they could end up in a better place. The Bloc Québécois may be a different story. So no opposition, none of those opposition parties want to trigger an election. Nobody wants one, which leads me to conclude that Parliament will continue. And opposition parliaments actually do get things done because there's horse trading. If the Conservatives want a pipeline, don't defeat the government. If, or if there's other things that want to move ahead, and I think they're going to have to look on a case-by-case basis, which is typically how minority governments work anyway. So I think it is sustainable for a time because it was clear that no opposition party, certainly no party, I would argue the Liberals don't want to trigger an election either. Canadians will punish whoever pulls that trigger at this point in the game.
Cole, how do you see this? Because as Susan mentions, you've got a Conservative leader facing a leadership review. You've got an NDP that's not picking its leader until late March. So are we in a bit of a holding pattern, a fairly sustainable, regular situation on Parliament Hill for the next several months?
Yeah, I would say so. And I agree with Susan in parts here too. Like the polling right now is as close as it was towards the end of the election we just had in April. So not dissimilar from the difference between 2019 and 2021. If we had an election today, it would be pretty similar to the result we have right now. So I think that the Liberals generally, they want to get some more wins in the window before they go back to the electorate in the next election. But I think one thing that they also have in mind is that, Donald Trump will be president until January 2029. I think the Liberals would very much like to have an election before Donald Trump is gone. The current base of the Liberal Party, their current voters, that's their number one concern. So if they still have Trump there, even if they completely mismanage the Canada-U.S. relationship, the Trump issue still animates enough of their base that they would want to go to an election on this issue again. But I think in the meantime, in terms of the composition of the House of Commons, I think that we're going to see every party tiptoe around all the confidence votes.
Last word to you, Susan.
This is the conservative take on how Pierre Poilievre's unfavorables are at 60% right now. And if you went to the polls, he hasn't made anybody like him anymore. He's lost an MP to a floor crossing. Another longtime member of his caucus is leaving. So the Conservatives will say, look over here, but Mr. Poilievre has his own problems at the moment, and that's one of the key reasons why he doesn't want to go to the polls.
Okay, we'll leave it there for now. Susan Smith, Cole Hogan, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks.